Thank you for asking me to talk tonight. I do apologise for my really long title of this talk. I was trying to fit lots of things in. But the second part is about my research I did for my doctoral degree. And the first part is really where I'm going with that sort of post my research. And in particular, which I'll talk about at the end, about the book that I'm doing, an edited book, which is going to come out hopefully next year, which is going to be called The Existential Crisis of Motherhood. So I thought I'd start off by talking about my journey into this particular research area. And don't worry, I'm not going to go back to starting from the very beginning of my life and give you a potted history, but I am wanting to talk a little bit about where my interest started off, and that is in identity. So I've been always interested in this idea of the self and identity, or whatever word you want to use to describe this idea of me. And I suppose I've been quite sort of perplexed and preoccupied with this idea of how can we be very changing being, and in terms of an existential view of self, as there'll be obviously a process of becoming, but at the same time having a sense of me in terms of continuation. So there's me at the age of 4 or 5. So I still feel like I was, in terms of that sense of myself, but obviously I'm completely different to who I was then. And so I was, when we did the book anyway on existential therapy, distinctive features, I came across Hume's idea of a kind of a commonwealth, in terms of thinking about identity, that we kind of have this idea of a commonwealth of elements which kind of holds us together, and then within that we have these changing aspects of ourselves. So inevitably then, my interest in identity moved into ideas of life transitions. What happens to us and our sense of ourselves and our identity when we have a life transition, when we have a life crisis. And I suppose I came across this in my own life, in terms of people who have experienced redundancy or bereavement, where suddenly events happened and they completely threw their sense of themselves up in the air, and they had to really question who they were, what their values and beliefs were. So, kind of coming from this sort of perspective of identity, life transitions, I did my master's at the New School, but back in Waterloo, and I was lucky enough to have Emily as my supervisor. And being the wise woman that she is, and I was talking about these ideas, and she said, why not do motherhood? Because it's an easy to research topic, because you kind of know who your participants are, it's quite visible, who they are, how you might get hold of them. And also, in terms of where I was in my life journey, I was thinking about becoming a mother myself. And so it seemed to be a really good idea to look at motherhood as research. So I did my master's degree. I did a small piece of qualitative research on identity and motherhood, and it really, I suppose, it sparked my interest in the subject, and it became, I think, really useful when I became a mother myself, because I had read all of these books on motherhood, and suddenly there I was as a mother, and I think actually I wonder how I would have experienced it if I hadn't have done all of that reading in preparation. It was certainly a really good preparation for my own experience. But I think as anyone who, I think as therapists, we, I suppose we start looking at the world and other people in a different way when we are therapists. And certainly I started looking at mothers, from a different perspective maybe than if I had gone in without doing all this reading and research. And so I started listening to what mothers were saying. And again, I was really sort of taken with this idea of how some mothers seem to cope quite well with motherhood, and how other mothers kind of really struggled. And I was thinking, what was it about that experience? What was it about the experience of motherhood that had such a different of outcomes, and that some people found it really, really difficult to cope with these situations, and others seemingly seemed to cope quite well. And I say seemingly because I think there's obviously quite a lot of how we project ourselves as mothers, but we don't necessarily feel able to say how we really feel. So I went into my research, my doctoral research, sort of coming from that background, and sort of thinking about that life changes completely and forever once a mother, once a woman becomes a mother. And I remember that for myself, when I was about to have my daughter. I suddenly thought, okay, I'm on this Ferris wheel, on this roller coaster, and there's no way off. This is it. This is going to be my life. And there was that sense of, that you've made this choice, and it has life-changing impact. So, what I wanted to look at for my doctoral research is just, in a kind of a broader way, just what is the experience of becoming a mother in that first year, and how do they make sense of the transition, and how do they deal with that kind of life-changing event. And I was also quite interested, obviously, from my own background in the existential research, is kind of really looking at the existential themes of motherhood. I'd already started thinking about motherhood in terms of, what are the things that kind of, how can we understand motherhood from an existential perspective? I guess we can see a different view of it. So the previous existential literature on motherhood is very scant, and I suppose it's not surprising really, because we're thinking about existential philosophers were predominantly male, and actually it's surprising really that very few existential psychotherapists or therapists have written about motherhood. So we have. But there were some, which is good, and Simone de Beauvoir, obviously, in her book The Second Sex, has got a chapter on motherhood. And she takes a very feminist perspective on motherhood. So she's really looking at, what the experience of motherhood is in society. And she was saying that basically women who, basically are kind of, as you say, shut up in the home with a baby, and that she doesn't have any external frame of reference, that she's not able to express herself in any other way than as a mother. And so then she becomes that role, and because she doesn't have a way of it, as sort of affirming herself as an individual, then society then also only sees her as a mother. And so it kind of becomes a sort of vicious circle in a way, that she can't establish herself in a different way, and then sort of becomes reduced to her role of being a mother. And as a consequence, her individuality is not given recognition. So then we've got Julia Kristeva. So although she's not strictly, well, she's a philosopher and a psychoanalyst, so she's coming from it from sort of a slightly different perspective. But again, took a feminist view on motherhood, and was looking at similarly to Simone de Beauvoir, was looking at, what are the discourses around motherhood. And she said the two main discourses was Christianity and science. And in both Christianity and science, the way that they sort of viewed the mother or the woman is almost like an empty vessel. So you have the Virgin Mary, who is seen as this kind of empty vessel that just sort of with all these vessels that just sort of carries the baby and is not actually connected to any of the sort of aspect of producing this baby. And science as well kind of reduces the mother sort of sees this as just like a maternal instinct, that actually the mother doesn't have any role to play. And so she said in both of those discourses in society, the mother gets reduced to silence. So more recently, we've got Elizabeth Butterfield, who is a philosopher, and she's looked at motherhood in the first year of a baby's life, and she was interested in this idea of mother's freedom. And she said that motherhood is ambiguous, and we're both individual and social, we're both free and determined. So we're always, as a mother, kind of caught between these tensions of, sort of not being able to establish ourselves, in an individual way, but we always have to take into consideration the social discourse that impacts us. And then I've got Emmy as well, who brought in an existential look at how birth kind of really highlights how our life and death situation. So that actually, sort of birth brings up the fact that, something about our mortality, and also something about the vulnerability of the newborn baby, and also the sort of mysteriousness of life, that the baby can be created. And again, I can certainly resonate with that in terms of my own, having my own children, and thinking, this is like a miracle, that I produced this living creature, baby. So, in terms of existential research, again, very limited. So the only piece of existential research at the time was a scoping review that Prinz et al. Did in 2013. And they looked at all the different research that's been done on motherhood, on the transition to motherhood in the last 10 years. And they reanalysed it to looking for existential dimensions. And what they said was becoming a mother was a significant life event. It's a transition where existential considerations regarding the meaning of life are invigorated. And then I've just added this one. So although Laura and Sinclair were not actually looking at motherhood from an existential perspective, they did look at postnatal depression sufferers. And they said that actually we should think about postnatal depression not as depression as such, but actually the experience of grieving over a lost self. So again, I think that sort of idea of how we lose ourselves or regain ourselves has a very existential feel to it. So as you can see, the existential literature on motherhood is quite limited. Whereas the general literature on motherhood is rather vast. And I think, when I first started doing my literature review research, we came up with thousands and thousands and thousands of pieces of research, things that people have written. So it seems that motherhood had been written from every different perspective, maybe just apart from the existential one. And so I had to really narrow down what I was going to be looking at in terms of my literature review, to just being very specific that I was looking at first-time mothers and transition, because I think otherwise I'd be completely overwhelmed by the amount of literature that is out there. And they came down to three broad categories in the literature. So the first one was around identities, quite a lot of research about identity, and some feminist perspectives on sort of the myth of motherhood, and how motherhood identity develops. And actually it's quite interesting that quite a lot of the motherhood identity studies that have been done actually have shown what we would think about as an existential view of self, that actually motherhood is a construction, motherhood identity is a construction, is a process. So it's actually quite a good confirmation. The other motherhood literature looks at social support and the importance of social support, and then the third category was the emotional experience of motherhood. But that, quite a lot of that was also looking at things like postnatal depression, which again I didn't choose to include because I was looking at what I call normal, whatever that is, normal mothers who haven't got any other mental health diagnoses or But I think the one thing that did strike me, and continues to strike me about the enormity of the literature and the continued interest in sort of trying to understand motherhood experience is just that. That although all of this work has been done and lots of things have been written about, there still seems to be something that we haven't quite grasped. There still seems to be something about this experience that preoccupies women, that causes women to kind of keep, searching and sort of thinking about it. And, you sort of, I spend a lot of time, reading Twitter accounts. You sort of get into the mother of the Twitter world. It's very interesting. But there is definitely something about this wanting to, make sense of their experience that doesn't seem to have been accounted for in maybe previous work. So what I did was I took a hermeneutic phenomenological approach to understand the meaning of the experience. I used Van Manen's lived experience method because he enabled me to have an existential dimension. He uses the existential heuristic of being able to look at research in terms of the lived body, lived space, lived time, and lived other. So I had 8 first-time mothers as my participants. They're aged between 32 and 39 years old, and their babies were between 9 and 14 months. I wanted to have this, close to, sort of, I think between 6 and 12 was what ideal, but I ended up getting on slightly more in terms of baby. But I wanted the experience to be close enough so that they were able to, give an account of how they felt before and after becoming a mother, but not too, sort of far away that they can remember, but also not too close to birth that they're kind of caught up in just surviving in those first 6 months. So all my participants were married and living with the father of their baby, so they were all really well supported mothers. So again, I think that's important to hold on to in the sort of thinking about the findings later on. These were seemingly normal mothers who were well supported, and they were still sort of, maybe, struggling with some of their ideas about motherhood. They all describe themselves as being white and British, and that's one of the limitations of the study, is that it didn't allow for any diversity. But in terms of homogeneity of the qualitative research, we did have that as an advantage as well. Okay, so I did 2 lots of existential analysis on my themes. So one was using Van Manen's life worlds. As I said, the lived space, lived body, lived time, and lived human relation. But I also wanted to look at the findings from structural existential analysis, because when I was doing the first existential analysis, I felt that it didn't really allow for the personal dimension to come out. And so I wanted to kind of see how SEA might enable a different way of understanding the themes. So I got 7 major themes and 1 minor theme. So quite a lot of the themes mirrored previous research. So kind of relationship with others, relationship with the baby, motherhood identity. But then there were other kind of themes that were more geared towards an existential dimension. So the first theme was being with others. And I think this theme was really about the importance of support. And previous research has shown that actually the amount of support mothers get, certainly in the first year, makes a huge difference to their experience. And I think there's some kind of statistics about the fact that those people who haven't got support are more likely then to go on to suffer things like postnatal depression or postnatal anxiety. But I think what was really interesting that came out of my research was this idea of resetting. And again, I think it's a really interesting concept to think about in terms of therapy as well. In terms of our weekly sessions with our clients, my participant said you had your week of starting to go insane, and then you meet up again. So she's talking about this very good group of mothers that she has become part of. And then it's, okay, this is normal. It resets you again. So that's really important. So this idea of actually finding other mothers who they could have, they could be honest, open and honest about their experience, really helped. You know, it had this whole thing of being, I can actually start, I can cope again. You know, before I felt like I couldn't cope. I think this participant said, you know, I've had days when I was head under the duvet, but somehow something about kind of like sharing of experience sort of reset them, so okay, I can do this again, I can cope, and then they go on. And I think it sort of mirrors very much what it's like in therapy as well, you know, that we kind of have to, you know, our clients hold on to difficult things and know that they've got their session on a Wednesday or their visits, and then they can, you know, that kind of keeps them going. But I think it's, you know, that part of this is also really important, because they were saying that actually there were lots of other mothers who weren't supportive because they weren't able to be honest, and that had kind of almost a detrimental effect. So it was really important for them to find mothers that they could actually connect with, and that they could, you know, talk about their experiences in an open way. And there's quite a lot of discussion in general in motherhood sort of circles around this whole thing about being able to talk and to be able to, you know, I think it's trying to overcome this idea of, you know, the perfect mother, and to be actually able to say, I'm really struggling, and to be able to, you know, to talk to other mothers about that. The other aspect of the being with others was about understanding others. And it felt like the mothers, in understanding trying to understand their babies, it sort of opened something up for them in terms of their relationships with other people. Like they started to become more understanding of other people around them, whereas before they might have been, you know, sort of more thinking about themselves maybe, or more dismissive of other people. But there was a kind of a general opening of themselves, and that, you know, they had to do for their baby, because they had to create some space for their baby, they had to try and understand their baby, but also it sort of translated to other people as well, and that they became more understanding and a bit more conscious of other people around them. So the second theme was about developing a relationship with the baby. So this is quite a big theme. There were 4 sub-themes. And this is very much about, you know, what they were learning together. So you find that you know that's the kind of behaviour that you've learned with them, and you don't consciously acknowledge what you've learned. So again, this kind of mirrors very much Naomi Sadler's work when she was in her book, What Mothers Do. And I think again it's this idea of mothers starting to thinking that they're going to go to books or other people to try and tell them what to do, and actually then they begin to learn that they need to learn from their babies, or even acknowledge what they've learned from their babies. So another part of that is gradually changing. So I don't know what I've learned. It's really hard because it's a gradual thing. You can't look down on me and see how I've changed, because just everyday things have gradually changed. So again, this sort of feeling of mothers feeling quite unskilled because they aren't able to see or acknowledge or notice the gradual changes that they're making, and actually, you know, the things that they're starting to understand their babies, that they're interacting with their babies in a different way. So what they were saying is, you know, it's really good to build a good relationship. So they're saying it's very magical. This participant saying it's me and my baby against the world. And they were all saying how easy mothering started to become when they got something back from the baby. So to start off with, when the baby felt like it was this unknown thing, that they kept crying and they didn't know what to do, and they felt completely unskilled. And as soon as the baby started to respond and started to give something back and to smile, then they felt the mothering experience was easier. So the third theme is living in time, which is really interesting, I think, certainly from an existential perspective. So the mothers were talking about living in the present. So they were saying, that time as they had known it suddenly ceased to exist. They were living in a completely new cycle of 3 or 4 hourly cycles of feeding the baby, being awake in the middle of the night and thinking everybody else is asleep and I'm awake, and being completely in the present, or just the immediate future, like what am I going to do next, or the immediate past, what's just happened. So just living constantly in the present. And also kind of connected to that is this all-consuming nature of motherhood. That actually, babies can just take up all of your thoughts, all of your days, and you don't get time to dwell on things. And I think that's a really important thing to think about in terms of how we can support mothers, because they have no space, even emotionally or psychologically, to process what has happened to them. They're just responding to their baby and thinking about what's the next thing. And this all-consuming nature can kind of feel very draining and tiring for the mother. And then also another element is it's never ending. You don't see the constancy of it. It's hard because it's the constant thinking, what am I doing next? And I think, when you've spoken to mothers, and from my own experience as well, I was just thinking, this baby will never sleep. Then people say, oh, but they will, in 6 months, in a year's time they'll be sleeping. And you just think, I have no even concept of what 6 months in a year would be like. I can't even imagine myself in that state. And it's very hard to project yourself into the future when you're constantly in the present. So it's very difficult to even think about yourself, or even think about what it would be like. And I do remember actually somebody saying to me, I've never met a 21-year-old who doesn't sleep through the night. And that was the one thing that kept me going. It's like, okay, my 21. It'll be fine. So the fourth theme, again, very existential, the unknown. So mothers were saying, it's the not knowing. So this mother was saying, it's exciting, I guess. I wouldn't say overwhelming, but it's entering the unknown. So this is suddenly, here were mothers, they were leaving this known world that they felt very in control of. They felt very much like they felt skilled and competent and all of those things. And then they were suddenly entering into this unknown world where they felt completely unprepared, de-skilled, and just not knowing what's going to come next. And that part of that dealing with the unknown was they started searching for answers. So they were looking at, constantly trying to glean bits of information and trying it out. And so you sort of understand why there is this enormous sort of baby literature, baby media out there, with magazines and books and sort of blogs about how you should be mothering in a particular way. Because mothers are searching for that, but then it also gives them contradictory information. Because actually what they need to do maybe is to sort of look to themselves and in the second theme, which is about kind of learning from their baby, but they're desperately sort of thinking, well, if I do this, then that will work. But then it kind of even goes down into things like, well, if I have this pram, then then I'll be a good mum. Or if I have these particular wooden toys, then that shows that I'm a really good mother. Or if I try this particular sleep technique, then that will get my baby to sleep. And I have to say they don't work. I've tried it. So there is this kind of constant searching for answers. But also one of the participants was saying that actually, you keep asking everyone until you got the answer you want to hear. So what the mothers were doing was they were asking lots of different people until they got the thing that kind of connected with them. And then that gave them the confidence maybe to say, okay, that's how I'm going to And then I think probably the biggest issue, existential issue that mothers face is this idea of responsibility. And all the mothers were just talking about the enormous amount of responsibility they felt on becoming mothers, and that they had no idea that this was going to, to be part of their lives. That kind of responsibility hits home. We're making these decisions and we don't know. So they suddenly realised that it wasn't just being responsible for themselves, but they were having now to be responsible for this vulnerable baby. And certainly in the first months, they were responsible for keeping that baby alive if they were breastfeeding. So it was a huge responsibility. And then seeing, understanding that the choices that they were making were going to have long-lasting impacts for their child. And, we even started to, they started to think about all the different choices that they would have to make for their child, and realising that they had to carry that responsibility for another. And I think that's really interesting when you think about it from an existential perspective. I'm looking at Sartre's work, for instance. Because he never considers being a man who didn't have children, what it would be like to have the responsibility of another. He talks very much about our own personal responsibility. But I think actually having responsibility for another person who's completely dependent on you for their existence is a completely different type of responsibility, and much more the burden, I think, than your own personal responsibility. And I think this really came out in the research. And then, not surprisingly, when you have that level of responsibility, then you'll have the worrying as well, which kind of goes hand in hand. And I spent the first 5 months constantly worrying about something. So again, it's that kind of a worry being connected to our responsibility and the vulnerability of the baby. And then the fifth theme is life is different. So again, nothing prepares you. So all of the participants were saying, I went to all the classes, I read all the books, but actually nothing prepares you for motherhood. And one participant said it's like being hit by a steam train, but in a good way. I'm not quite sure how there is a good way of being hit by a steam train, but I think it's like, you can get that image. I was talking to my husband about this morning, and I was like, there's a steam train, electric trains these days. But then there's this idea, life before doesn't exist. So suddenly, because of this all-encompassing nature of motherhood, it's almost like their past life just doesn't exist. They can't even imagine what it was like, before having the baby. And it just seems in a very, a distant past. And that life is different. It was like living in a different life. Everything about their life had changed. Their routines, the way that they lived, being able to go to the loo, all of those things had completely changed again. And then the shock, which again is connected. I think you're just in shell shock. I think it takes a while to process what happens. So these are all women who had all wanted a baby, planned for a baby in a stable relationship, and they felt, actually this is something that's come as a real shock, even though I'm not prepared for it. And just because I think life is so different from what it was before. So the sixth theme is challenging expectations. So again, there's two aspects of this theme. So there's the surprise of feeling confident. So quite often mothers were feeling so unconfident and so de-skilled that actually when they were finding things that actually, I know what I'm doing, they got quite surprised at that. And I was surprised to see how confident I was that he was all right. But equally, on the other side, you've got this feelings of out of control. Being out of control, it was a big shift in my expectations really, and how to deal with it. There was one participant who was talking about how she'd gone to Gina Ford and she'd got her schedule, and the baby didn't quite know about the schedule and didn't really kind of fit in. And then of course, then she felt like she was a failure because it hadn't worked, even though she planned everything and done a nice timetable. There was a kind of a really sense of feeling out of control, that actually this was a relationship, and she was just one part of that relationship, and had to kind of go with the other part, which is the baby. But then there was the other side of it, with a new purpose in life. So all the mothers were talking about how their priorities had changed. You know, that all the things that had been important to them before having a baby, like their career maybe, or fitness, or things like that, suddenly everything changed. And it was that the baby then became their focus. And you realise it's not about you. And this participant said that the baby becomes their legacy. So that's too weird a word, but my achievement. So you're kind of really investing and seeing how important it is in terms of developing their relationship, and how guiding and nurturing the baby. And then the final theme was motherhood identity, which again was kind of really mixed in terms of what the mothers were saying. And I think it's really interesting as well when you think about this is mothers who were sort of at the end of their first year of mothering. And so there were 4 different aspects to this theme. So there was a real sort of trying to make sense of their experience at this point. So they were sort of saying, well, I don't feel like a mother. So they were saying, they had an expectation of what being a mum was, and they just didn't feel it. It felt weird, this word mother. They didn't connect to it. They didn't, they knew that they were a mother, but they didn't, identify with the word. One of the participants were talking about saying, well, I see all these adverts on television, and mums will mumsy, and I'm not like that. I'm not like that typical mother view that she had in her mind. But then, on the other hand, they're saying, when they're adopting motherhood identity, it's like you get stripped back to nothing, or you count for nothing, and the only important thing is the baby. So, sort of a sense of, that actually, everything goes in terms of identity. They're not sure what their identity is. And then on the other hand, not feeling any different. So it's a real sort of paradox in this theme, that on the one hand they don't feel any different, on the other hand, they feel like their identity has been stripped back, but also that their life is very different, and inevitably that's going to impact on their identity. And also there was something about how motherhood is an important role. Mothers were talking about how they were creating the next generation, and having an impact on society. But it felt very much like there was when you think about it from an existential perspective, about how we, create an identity out of our experiences. Here were mothers having this experience of their life being very different, and hadn't quite assimilated, what their life was into how they felt about themselves. And I think, at this stage of their motherhood experience, they were just starting to do that for themselves, to try and work out how they felt about themselves as a mother. And that rather than some of the previous research looked at, how mothers feel that they've lost their sense of self, actually it felt very much like this was, these mothers were talking about how they were adding on an extra dimension to themselves. So it's not like, they're saying I'm not feeling any different. So there was still a sense of me, but then there was this mother aspect that was added on, which again, links in with an existential view, that actually as we exist and experience things, then our sense of ourselves changes to incorporate that element. So, doing the existential analysis, looking at Van Manen's life worlds, you can see that in each of the different life worlds, there is a different theme. So, in the lived body, there was developing a relationship because the mothers also felt that they were responding physically to their baby. I think the most...
I was wondering about that in relation to
Yes. How they... Yes. Yes, and that's a really interesting thing actually, is that I was expecting more of the physical part, you know, of the birth, of breastfeeding, but actually they didn't talk about their embodied experience, which is why it's quite limited in that, you know, I would have thought there would be a lot more on that dimension. But, yeah.
Were a lot of them still breastfeeding?
Some were, yeah, some were. Some have started going back to work. So, but again, I suppose, again, by that stage, towards, you know, the end of the first year, babies would be weaned as well, and they might have got a handle on, you know, the feeding, so it became maybe less of an issue for them.
But maybe because it might be so traumatic, not in a negative way necessarily, but you're still quite close to the physical experience at that point, enough that you may not actually want to or be conscious of it, because you're either still in it because you're breastfeeding or recovering from it, and it just might be something that might be too close.
No, that's true. I think the interesting thing is the lived space part, you know, which is where you kind of, where the mother is kind of having to, you know, to be in the space, which is, you know, what she creates in her environment, you know, in terms of living in time, the unknown, life is different, challenging expectations. And again, I suppose that's part of, you know, how she's sort of being, creating a space for herself and her baby.
Sorry, I don't know if you're welcoming questions at this point.
No, that's fine. No, absolutely.
Interjection. Can I just ask you, as part of your study, did people feel more de-skilled, shocked and overwhelmed, etc., the older they were? So did you find, for example, that the 38-year-olds were expressing more of a sense of shock than the 32-year-olds at all?
I didn't notice any difference in terms of the age of the participants, in terms of that. They seemed to be all of them seemed to, in fact there was only one mother who had a very different experience from the others, you know, who didn't find it as, you know, as much of a shock. But yeah, you know, there wasn't an obvious age implication for that one.
Curious one thing, maybe when I answer this later, but from one of the early slides, the aspect of one mother feeling she's with her child against the world. How did that strike you? It seems a bit out of the flow of everything else.
I suppose I saw that as kind of them being like, you know, that they developed that kind of strong bond, and that is, you know, that they were sort of together, you know, I suppose against the world, you know, I took that as feeling that, you know, that they become quite a, you know, sort of a close unit. But she didn't elaborate in the research, so questions? Okay, I'll go on. I'll be getting a bit sick of my voice then. Okay, so looking at the existential analysis using SEA, so again we've got, you know, a spread of the themes across the different dimensions, with, you know, quite a number in the Eigenbelt, which is the personal dimension, but also in the Überwelt, which is the spiritual dimension, and then the Mittelwelt and the Unterwelt. So it kind of feels very much that at that stage in my participants' life, their personal world and their spiritual world were the ones that were of more concern to them. So the research offers an existential understanding of the transition to motherhood. So I think that really the things demonstrates the complexity of the transition, but actually this is not just about the mother's sort of thinking about it in terms of birth and the social support, but actually there's a lot of other aspects to the experience that was coming out, and that actually, some of the mothers have got lots of things that they're contending with. And actually, I think that's kind of born out in the work that I've been doing with mothers. That quite a lot of the themes that I found in my research are things that people are bringing, mothers are bringing into therapy. So the existential analysis showed that mothers experience changes in all dimensions of existence. And I think, again, that's really important, that this is, when every aspect of your life has changed, there's no place where you feel settled and at home, that everything had to change. And I think, that maybe this aspect of motherhood has not been understood so much. So although people talk about it as a life-changing experience, my research kind of showed just how life-changing it was. That actually, in terms of their physical experience, in terms of birth and breastfeeding, but also how they live in time had changed, their social relationships had changed, how they thought about themselves, in terms of their personal responsibility and freedom had changed, and then there was a re-evaluation of their values and beliefs and priorities. So that kind of everything that you can think about in terms of a person's life had suddenly been called into question and had to be thought again and re-evaluated. And I think because of this, sort of some of these existential ideas, that although my research was looking at the ontological experience, they were looking, it did demonstrate there was an ontological aspect to motherhood as well, in terms of this confrontation with existence. So I just wanted to now sort of talk very briefly about existential crisis, if I've got time. Because I think, when I sort of started thinking about how we are confronted by the existence in terms of, becoming a mother, it then started making me think about, existential crisis. And so crisis is often defined as a time of intense difficulty, trouble or danger, but you wouldn't think about that this mother with her baby was in crisis. I suppose for mothers who had suffered birth trauma, then yes, that there's elements of that. When you start thinking about crisis in other ways, so Emmy van Desmond describes it as everything is turned upside down. There's an upset to the status quo, where everything is altered and looks different. Or Jacobson says crisis is a disruption to the normal course of life. And Bournemouth says a crisis is something extraordinary, personal, and decisive. Then you can start thinking about motherhood from this perspective. That actually what women are facing is a kind of a crisis. Their lives are very different. Everything is altered. Everything is turned literally upside down. So I started thinking about crisis in a different way, and then I went back to the Greek term crisis, which means decision, or to choose, and I thought that was so relevant to the mother's experience because everything had to be chosen. They had to make decisions about absolutely everything, from when to feed, what to feed, how to sleep, when to wean, what schools, what toys, what nappies, There's so many decisions that a mother has to make, and that it feels that was very much linked to this idea of crisis. So, what is an existential crisis? It can occur when something happens which is outside our normal experience and which causes into question all elements of our existence. And I think, from my research, it feels that this is what mothers are facing. That they become aware of their existence in a new way, that something gets opened up for them, and they start thinking about things like their responsibility, mortality, choice, and all of those elements. So, 5 features of existential crisis. The first one, when we realised that what we thought was normal and common sense is subjective chance and uncanny in nature. and we realise there are more options than we allowed ourselves to imagine. And I think for this one, it's very much kind of connected to the theme of the unknown, that mothers kind of go into motherhood in the sense of being, in the unknown, and that things can feel out of control. Recognising our freedom is, in this way, causes us to feel anxiety. So when mothers start to become aware of their choices and their responsibility, and then obviously their freedom, and become aware of their freedom, often this will lead to feelings of anxiety. Heightened aware of death makes us re-examine our lives. Again, I think the birth and the vulnerability of the baby brings death, or the idea of mortality, to the forefront. There are many choices available, but we have no wisdom or certainty that we'll make the right choice. And so, again, I think this is highlighted in what the mothers were saying, is that they were searching for answers. They wanted to make the right choice for their babies, but they didn't know what the right choice was, or they didn't know how that was going to, how these choices were going to pan out for them. We must always choose and suffer from our choices. That is our everyday burden. So there's something about, not knowing, what the impact of our choices, and that's something that we have to carry. So looking at motherhood as an existential crisis, and motherhood reveals a woman's sense of mortality, not just the babies, but also her own. And I think, sort of speaking to mothers, they talk about, well, what happens if I die? What's going to happen to my baby? Who's going to look after my baby? So I think there's, it does bring their own death to the forefront, as well as their babies. It reveals the mother's freedom through her responsibility and her choice. A certain world is replaced with an unknown one. She has changes in terms of her temporality and how she exists in time, and that leads to a re-evaluation of her beliefs and values and a new purpose in life. So motherhood is a life-changing event, and it changes on all four dimensions of life. And I was thinking about, Stern talks about the birth of the mother, so when the baby's born and the mother's also born. But I was also thinking about motherhood as being an existential rebirth. I was looking at Emma's ideas around that somehow, that we're born existentially, in a sense. The mother, when they become a mother, because we become more aware of our existence. And that in motherhood, the mother not only creates a space for her baby physically during pregnancy, but she's also creating heart room, which is an idea of saddlings, where we become open more emotionally to the baby as well. So there seems to be also an opening up of existence in terms of existential space, where we become more aware. And I think it seems to be something that happens just maybe in those early years of motherhood, and actually as we become more connected to our mothering experience, maybe that kind of closes us down a little bit as well. So I'll just skip over that. So this is my last slide, if you can see. You can have some questions. So the implications of practice of working with a mother. So sort of feelings of shock and the unknown nature of motherhood that need to be acknowledged. So I think that's really important. What I've noticed with working with mothers, that actually, that they can find this really useful to just have that acknowledged for them. To recognise and mourn loss of the mother's past life or identity. Sometimes that's really important, if they feel that they've lost sense of themselves. Acknowledge the enormity of responsibility that the mother now faces in respect to her baby. And again, I think that's another important aspect to consider. To encourage flexibility and surrendering to the experience rather than trying to control it. So I've heard from mothers who felt that they were completely out of control in terms of their motherhood experience, felt that actually by surrendering and letting go and going with the baby, that actually that kind of helped them. You know, when they were trying to control things that felt chaotic, they were feeling worse about their experience. Allow mothers the space to reflect and make sense of their experience. So again, you know, when mothers feel that they've got an all-encompassing experience and that there's no space, actually creating space in the therapy can actually help them to really sort of start making sense of their motherhood experience. And challenge expectations of the perfect mother and other social narratives around motherhood, which I think is a big one. And encourage mothers to notice and find their own way of being a mother. And then recognise the complexity of the transition to motherhood and acknowledge the changes on all dimensions. So I suppose just to finish is to say that you know, these were things that came out of working with mothers who didn't have any mental health issues. So if you bring in any other vulnerabilities that the mothers themselves may have, you know, you're sort of adding on more difficulty. You know, it becomes a lot more difficult and complex. So, any questions?
Or any thoughts? Share any thoughts?
Well, I was very interested in your concept of responsibility. Obviously, I imagine every parent's view of experience is a bit different. But that struck home in a way, and it reminded me of a young Yemeni woman that I saw when I was assessing women for family courts, women with babies. And she, amongst other things, had cut the frenulum of her baby because she thought the baby had a tongue tie and was failing to thrive. And social services, because of that, and because her mother thought that she was an unfit mother, were taking out a parental order to remove the baby. And as I thought about it, I realised that was a clash of perception of responsibility. Because this young mum felt that she had a very important responsibility to her baby, and that she had to help the baby thrive, and she had to take this rather desperate step. Social services in Grandma had the opposite view. They thought she was irresponsible, and it was their responsibility to take charge of the baby. And that was such a passionate issue that the family court judge kept bringing it back to court because she couldn't get her head around the issue. And that, you know, was so emotional, that thing, but because both sides thought that they were the last, you know, the final arbiter, the final person who was responsible for the baby. And in the end, the family court judge, fortunately, sided with the mother and said she was ultimately responsible for her baby and trying to do what she could for the baby. It was, you know, just seems to me such an amazing thing. You hold a tiny child and you give it its first bath, and you think, my God, what would happen if I dropped him or her? But for a mother who has to do all these other things as well, day in, day out, and, you know, is criticised if she doesn't get that. It's a terrific responsibility. And you're at the age of your mothers, probably made them more able to cope with that, because they presumably take other responsibilities. But for a 14-year-old girl or a 15-year-old girl, you know, it must be extraordinary.
And I think that's, you know, maybe another limitation of the study is that it was of that particular age group. And I think obviously, you know, sort of younger mums, or, you know, mums who were, you know, who weren't financially stable or weren't in, you know, single mums, their experience would be very different. But yeah, I think still there's that responsibility, and I guess for teenage mums, you know, whether they feel responsibility for themselves, doing this towards their baby's fine.
But you were trading the ability to reflect on the experience for, you know, being lost in it, which is, I can understand why you made that decision.
But I think that responsibility is such a, you know, sort of a big thing actually, and I think it's almost when mothers say nothing prepares me for motherhood. It's almost like actually nothing prepares me for the responsibility of motherhood. It seems to be what they're saying, because it's, you know, that you don't actually realise what that feels like until you're in it and you're a mother.
And the power over another human being
Yeah.
is the
Yeah.
astonishing thing.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
I really enjoyed it. Thank you very much, your talk. And I was quite taken by your talk, what you mentioned about time, and time changing so
Yes.
dramatically.
Yeah.
But I wondered about why you chose motherhood as opposed to parenthood. You know, just think about the possible fathers in here.
Yes.
And how much of all this would apply also to men.
Yeah.
Thinking about plans.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. We and I were talking about that earlier today, actually, because you know, I suppose I chose motherhood because it was personally interesting to me, and I had been immersed in the world of mothers, you know, as a new mum myself, and so I suppose that was my, you know, choice in that sense. But I think, yes, I think there is, you know, I think there is obviously a crossover in parenting. But you know, I suppose talking to, you know, I wonder about responsibility, because I do, you know, I think men, fathers feel responsibility, but I wonder whether it's in the same way. And I think that would be a really interesting study to look at, you know, how responsibility is viewed from the father's perspective and the mother's perspective.
Except that you can't generalise, can
No,
you?
no.
Because when I think back to when I became a mother 38 years ago, and I was the main breadwinner, and I had no maternity leave because I was part-time and, you know, self-employed, and I found myself as my tiny little baby going to work to teach in central London near Oxford Circus on the underground with a, you know, 3-week-old baby, and feeling completely overwhelmed, being both the mother responsible for his child and the breadwinner responsible for his family. And I think that if fathers stay at home looking after babies, they feel very similar emotions to mothers. And when you are a mother going out to work, then you have both those bits, and it gets very complicated indeed. And there is very little understanding in society for that kind of thing. Very little support. It's very difficult to get people even to not get irritated if your child starts crying, even on the underground, or if you have to breastfeed in the middle of teaching. All these things are terribly complicated because you not only do you feel responsible, but you also feel guilty, which is far worse than responsibility, isn't it?
Yeah. And actually, I think, you know, the guilt, you know, there's quite a lot of literature around this whole, you know, the guilt is when mothers go back to work, there's the guilt that they feel, and then if mothers don't go back to work, there's also guilt. Like, you know, guilt is a part of, that experience.
Nobody spoke about guilt though.
No, nobody should still speak about guilt, actually, which is very interesting. But
yes, why? Why did that not happen?
yeah.
But also nobody mentioned fear.
That's absolutely.
Yeah.
That's my
Terror.
memory of mother.
Yeah.
It's just fear.
Yeah.
Absolute
Terror,
Yeah.
real terror all
Yes.
the time,
Yeah.
even when asleep.
Yeah.
Yes.
There are two other things that I felt weren't mentioned. So one is, and my mum's here, she's a psychotherapist. A lot of my world revolves around my relationship with my mum anyway. But a lot of my experience becoming I've got a 15-month-old at the moment, who's my first child. And my relationship with my mother was a massive experience for me that was never discussed at NCT or like books. And that, I don't know if that was a thing. And then the other thing was I've really enjoyed becoming a mother because it kind of helps cement almost my political and ethical views. And you talked before about the kind of Gina Fords and whatnot, and I I began to think quite early on about it being a kind of spectrum of left and right. And on the left you've got your baby-led weaning, gentle sleep mums, and then on the right you've got your Gina-formed sleep training, crying out mums. And I feel like we were really quickly catapulted into having to make massive decisions about who we were that taught me who I was politically and ethically very, very quickly. And as I found myself in, you know, I'd say sort of 25% away from an extreme left-wing thinking about the whole thing. So I've enjoyed it because I felt like it taught me a lot about myself that I didn't really realise before. And I didn't sort of see whether or not there was any of that talked about. It was all about what was being done to them and the trauma of it. But what about what they learned about themselves from becoming one?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose it did come out in that kind of relationship with the baby that came out in terms of what they learned about themselves. You know, in terms of how they learned to become a mother. You know, once they kind of put the books to one side and they were just actually relating to their baby, you know, then they sort of started to see, how they were creating that relationship and how they were actually learning with the baby, you know, rather than doing something to the baby. It was very much a kind of a being with the baby and learning with the baby, you know, something that created out of that. But yes, I suppose there was less about, you know, one of the mothers I mentioned, I mean, she did talk about that Gina Ford thing, but I suppose, you know, but then there was also the mother who talked about the adverts and not wanting to be a mum. So there is lots of, you know, what the social discourse on motherhood makes it very complicated for mothers to decide. You know, mothers don't, you don't talk about what type of mother you're going to be at NCT. You know, you don't. So yes, I think that, you know, yes, you are suddenly thinking, well, what am I? And I suppose that connects with the values and beliefs, that actually everything has to be renegotiated, revalued, you know, what they thought, you know, what was important for them, how they wanted to, you know, to be a mum, how they wanted to, you know, to raise their babies.
And to reflect on how they were mothered and how that affects.
Yeah, I mean, that was an interesting one because I know it's come out in other research about relationship with mothers. It came out a little bit with some of the mothers, but not enough to make it a theme.
I think unless someone sowed the seed of thought and invited you to consider it, it's not naturally unless it's a thing that you talk about often.
But I think, you know, the mothers who did mention it talked about how they then started to reflect on their own parenting and to reflect on their mothers and getting a new understanding of their mothers. So sort of like, you know, maybe, oh, well, okay, now I can see it from my mother's perspective, whereas maybe seeing their mothers in a very different kind of way beforehand.
Yes, it's a sort of a new respect for your mother, isn't it?
Yes.
It's like, oh my God, you're not just my mother, you were a mother to a baby.
That is me.
And also the absence of that, if you don't have a mother, then you have a
Well,
relationship.
yes.
For that, as you try to become a mother, it's really much harder.
And also if you have a bad relationship with your mother, it can be really, really difficult as well, because you might want to have that support, but the relationship doesn't allow for it. So I think it's a complicated thing, actually.
Yes,
mothers and mothers.
Yes, and the fear of reminding yourself of doing things that you didn't like your parents doing. That's more later on, more and more. As kids grow up.
Yes, it's great. As the mothering becomes more.
Yes.
Also, as you, in this day and age, have to rely on grandparents to look after kids. Say you're, and I'm not necessarily saying this is the situation for me, but if you're having an experience where you're kind of at odds with what your mothering was, and at the same time relying on your parents to look after your child, that's really complicated.
Very true.
Yeah, so you mentioned that the transition is partially about becoming a mother, and that there's a sort of cultural and social background towards that. Sometimes it seems like there's a lot of anger directed towards mothers. I'm thinking about Shamima Begum at the moment, who's probably the most recent mother in the public eye. You know, she's 19 and, obviously made some terrible choices and has now lost two of her children. Recently, just gave birth the other day. And the anger directed at the desire to come back and have the baby here was really surprising. Like that you know that not only is she returning, but she wants to have a baby on the National Health Service as well. And you know, obviously, you know, there's a lot of quite coarse writing in the newspapers and in the headlines particularly. But yeah, there seems to be we seem to have real trouble with this idea that these women are in charge of this dependent person and require our support. And I wonder if, because I didn't hear much about anger in this at all. Sometimes the baby can sound like it's very, well, it's learning about you as well, and it knows what pitches of whines and anger can really rile you up, and how you sometimes feel, it can make you feel like you're not doing enough to help this baby at this time. So, did your research give you any sort of insight into the sort of this idea of the mother as well, one as a sort of contested site of, like, you know, sort of anger and the role of women and the role of reproduction in society. And did any of the parents that you spoke to have any sort of sense of that sort of sense of
I think not so
cultural
much,
reproduction?
yeah, I think not so much anger. I think it was more the opposite of feeling, you know, of having to confront feelings of, you know, not. I mean, I suppose, you know, mothers are always in a context, aren't they? And I suppose in terms of our context, in terms of our, you know, culture, there are specific discourses that are going through those cultures, and I suppose, you know, there's lots of things about, you know, the idea of, you know, I think there was a kind of an idea that, you know, that mothers, you know, has a huge impact psychologically on the babies. You know, that's, you know, sort of psychological literature that kind of looked at that, and, you know, so I suppose there's, you know, there is a sense that, you know, there's a lot of responsibility also put on the mother from society in terms of, you know, what role, you know, what she's going to be like, and, you know, the role that she's going to take. I think, you know, the anger part didn't really come out in the research. I think there was a lot of sadness and feelings of failure in some ways. You know, it would have been interesting, I think, now going back to kind of almost to have done a more of an emotional, you know, look at the themes, but I didn't at that stage. So there's always some more research to be done about, you know, some of those, you know, the emotional parts that are coming out. But certainly from my own work with others subsequently, a lot of the mothers do talk about, you know, sort of feeling, you know, at odds with societal discourse, and, you know, and feeling that, you know, as Amy was talking about, you know, the kind of the paradoxes of being, you know, a working mum and the guilt, and, you know, she's trying to juggle things, and the sense of failure and feeling like not living up to, you know, sort of social norms maybe, but also a real fear, and I think this is a problem that we have, is that the real fear of being able to say, I'm struggling, or I feel angry with the baby, or there are times when, you know, I just want to stay in bed and not do anything, for fear of social services coming in and taking the baby away. And, you know, a lot of the mums, I think, because I work privately, there's almost a feeling like this is the safest space to talk about these things. If I talk about these to my doctor or to somebody who's talking therapist, then it'll be straight on to social services and I'll lose my baby. So, yes, I think there are that element around in motherhood, but it didn't particularly come out in my research.
It's an odd one, isn't it? Because the mums are usually blamed for this sort of, even if the dad, like, disappeared, like, the mum's sort of responsible. Like, it's the bold step that she took to have a baby and try imperfectly to try to steward this child into a happy, well-adjusted adult, despite all of that. And doesn't seem fair. And
No.
also there's, I'm struck by how when some of my friends have had children, that they lose lots of friends as well. They get quite an ordeal.
Yes, and I think also, just the way that our society is set up is, it doesn't suit either parents, really. Lots of dads feel that they've got to go out and work and they don't then get part of being, a parent in the same way. And, I think we should go to a more Scandinavian view where everyone works part-time, everyone's involved in bringing up the baby, everyone gets an opportunity to work, and that companies need to think about being different in the way that they're structured. It's the way, I talk a lot, a lot of my friends, found going back to work easy when their children went to school because you could have, childcare, you can drop them off at 7, pick them up at 6, you can do a full day's work. As soon as they go to school and they're doing 9 till 3:15, it's impossible to find a job like that. But then there's also an expectation that you've got to, that there's also an expectation that they want to work or that society expects them to work. But there's no, sort of provision. So there's some good places that offer flexible working, but that's rare.
Flexible work, definitely. Can I challenge you with something? You say at some point, I can't remember when, quite in the beginning, that it is an ontological issue.
Yeah.
I find that a very interesting claim. I've been thinking about that for a long, long time. You may remember that Hans Kohn used to start to make the claim that sexuality was one of the ontological issues. But normally speaking, an ontological issue is something without which we wouldn't be human, or, existence wouldn't be possible. So it's clearly not the case that if you choose not to become a mother, and certainly for a man they'll never become a mother, that it is then an ontological issue. On the other hand, procreation is clearly an ontological issue, because without that, the human race wouldn't carry on. So what is your reason for calling it ontological? I find that very fascinating.
Well, I suppose I was looking at it in terms of, sort of something that was shared amongst mothers. Yes, it's different because it's not for all human beings, but there was something ontological in the sense of what was shared in terms of the experience amongst mothers. I was coming from that perspective, I guess.
Yes, so perhaps that is true. If you make the claim that without there being mothers, then there wouldn't be a human race, and therefore that act of giving birth and nurturing and educating is in fact an essential element of being, isn't it? But it's an essential element of being that we can step outside of, or that some of us never take part in, nevertheless.
Yeah.
Which is true for sexuality too.
Yeah.
But isn't true for being born or dying.
Yeah.
Or living with other people, which are all essential things for all of us. So it's like there's a second kind of category.
Yes, yeah.
It's almost ontological, but not obligatory, not mandatory.
Yes, or not for everyone. Yes. I suppose for women who choose not to be mothers, or women who can't be mothers, or as you say, as for fathers as well.
There was also a politically incorrect implication, which I think many people still agree with, that a mother is not just a woman. She's something of a different kind of being.
Yes.
Whereas a father is probably not a different kind of man. It's a kind of more casual thing. I wouldn't say you would have ontologies of fathers, but you're kind of saying it, which when you become a mother, you change the nature of your being.
But you do. Seems to me quite obviously the case.
Seems to me to be an ontological.
Does anybody disagree with that?
myself thinking about what was talked about before, about the anger of the role and what's being projected into mothers by society. And I think about envy, actually, in this context. And whether women are permitted to express these sorts of ideas, and men have to keep quiet about it. I imagine that to become a father is a huge change, but you have to carry on as if it isn't. You have to just carry on for society in a different way.
I'm not sure. You become more responsible knowing you're a father, don't you? There's a new sort of burden of looking after a family.
Yes,
Most of the time.
definitely.
But your sense of self, aside from your responsibility, and the time you have and your ability to go to the loo, is also changing. So,
I mean, for the father as well.
as much as, I mean, based on if they're
closely
being dad
involved.
at home. But even if they're not involved, they might have made the decision or been taken from that situation, so that they still have an experience of the situation, even if they're not the ones in it.
That's true. Yeah.
I think it's certainly an area in which more research could be usefully done. In fact, we've got one of our students at the moment looking at first-time fathers and identities. So again, that could be very interesting. I have to change my slides when that comes out.
Somebody said something really interesting before, and I was wondering if you would share this with the NHS, because I feel that they're very much aware of your home visitors and midwives of the whole postnatal depression thing, perhaps to the other extreme. And now, as you were saying, or somebody was, if you demonstrate any of the kind of anxieties that people feel you've provided a space for them to explore, then there's the risk that you're going to be labelled. And you almost have to defend yourself and be overconfident and say, I really know myself, it's really okay, and I'm sure that breastfeeding is quite difficult for anybody. But I'm sure they find this very useful, and in fact it's a responsibility, I'd say, that you have to kind of share it with them, because I think more needs to be understood.
Yeah. But it's interesting, I've been going to there's a birth trauma conference that's held every year, and I suppose it's quite interesting, sort of hearing GPs saying, we just basically prescribe antidepressants for moms who come in, and actually the complexity is that it could be postnatal anxiety, postnatal OCD, postnatal depression, postnatal psychosis, birth trauma, PTSD, there's a whole range
Just
of
being human.
yeah, well, just being human, and this is it, actually I get, I've got mums who come in and go, I've been diagnosed with postnatal depression, and actually it's just, no, you've just been a mother, actually, you haven't, and actually just acknowledge what you've gone through, in quite a short period of time, that they're able to, reevaluate their whole experience, and see themselves in a very different way, without having medication.
I think that raises a really interesting point there about how the nature of the way that that it's set up in the West means that when a mother is going through this thing, she's suddenly kind of put into a very clinical, professional kind of relationship, where actually when she's chatting with whether it's midwife or doctors or health visitors, there's this immediate kind of professional, non-professional dynamic, and what that actually means about how everything's perceived, both in the eyes of the other, but also how she then perceives herself. And the fact that that's something that, to my mind, feels it's something that in the Western world anyway is certainly very much the case, and wouldn't necessarily be the case in other places. But what that means for the mother's identity, and also for the sense of crisis that happens.
I think there's definitely a medicalisation of birth and early motherhood. And also, in the West, we're the only societies who isolate the mother after birth. Most societies have a kind of like an easing in 6 months, looking after the baby. All the jobs are done, and the mother is just left alone, literally, as someone both of us said, shut up in the house with their baby without any support. And not able to reach out for support for fear of, what might happen.
I think it's important, though, not to romanticise what it's like to have babies without medical support.
Yes. I'm not suggesting that I'm medical support.
I remember a woman who had to walk 20 miles in obstructed labour on the Congolese border. And when she arrived, I was a medical student there. They did an emergency symphysiotomy, and she died in a few hours because it was too late to walk 20 miles. So I think our idea of birth in the fields is simply painless and lovely and everything. And of course, the infant mortality is enormous too. I mean, I agree that a sterile clinical environment can be very frightening.
I think it's less about that. I think it's more about, like, from the very beginning, as soon as you become pregnant, you have to go to your GP and there's the testing and the measuring. And I know on the one hand, it is about to increase the life expectancy. But I think it then becomes that the women become feeling like it's almost that this is something unnatural that's happening, or that it becomes this medical issue. And I think we haven't quite got the balance, that actually that we can have, a more, we have to have a medical side to it, or a clinical side to it to, as you say, completely protect mother and baby. But there also needs to be a kind of a softening as well in terms of how we deal with it as a more non-medicalised way. And I think, it's interesting actually when you're talking about birth trauma, that actually, quite a lot of women who've experienced birth trauma, it's not actually necessarily the actual birth that's traumatic, it's the experience of how they've been treated by other people. And that then becomes a very clinical thing, that suddenly they're risk of the theatre, nobody's telling them what's happening, nobody's explaining it. That becomes the trauma part of it, rather than the actual experience of birth.
At the same time, they talk about the farce that is the birth plan.
Yeah, well, that's a whole other talk, isn't it?
We haven't got time for that.
I completely agree.
That's a whole other session.
Yeah.
Just before we thank Claire for one last time, next month's lecture is on forensic psychotherapy with a psychotherapist called Marcus Price. Also in April we're having our AGM, and we're going to be also looking for people to join us on the committee and just help grow the society. So if anyone's interested, do let us know. And a big thank you to Claire for tonight's show.